Hi everyone, welcome to the Heart Healthy Eating Nutrition Education Session Part 2. For those of you who are new, my name is Danielle and I am the registered dietitian working at Minto-Mapleton Family Health Team, primarily out of the Drayton site. So some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today include exploring blood cholesterol. So we're going to be looking at the different types of cholesterol in the bloodstream and how different diet and lifestyle practices can influence these numbers. We're also going to be continuing on the topic of eating for heart health, so specifically talking about nutrients like sodium, sugar, dietary fat, and fiber. First, let's start off by talking about dietary sodium. Sodium is an essential mineral, but too much can raise the blood pressure and cause the body to retain a lot of fluid, putting extra strain on the heart and on the blood vessels. The body requires about 1,500 milligrams of sodium each day. However, most Canadians get a lot more than this 1,500 milligrams. As I mentioned, excessive sodium intake increases the blood pressure, which is going to increase the risk of kidney disease and heart attack and stroke. On average, about 60% of Canadians consume about 4,000 milligrams or more per day of sodium. Comparing that to the recommended intake, you want to aim for about 2,000 milligrams or less of sodium per day. And if you're wondering about per serving, you want to aim for about 200 milligrams of sodium per serving of food. So now let's take a look at how to read nutrition facts labels to better understand dietary sodium in particular. So again, as always, when you're looking at the nutrition facts label, the first thing to look at is that serving size, right? All of the nutrition information listed below is based off of that serving size, so it's important to reflect on how much you're actually eating, whether or not it's more or less than the serving size, because your sodium intake will change according to how much you're actually eating. Then if you move down the table, you look for the word sodium. Generally, it's listed in milligrams or mg, and it's also shown as a percentage of the daily value. And this percentage daily value helps you to quickly understand whether or not this food is high or low in sodium. So as a general guide, you want to aim for foods with less than 200 milligrams per serving. You can also use the percentage daily value as a quick reference. So again, for quick review, 5% daily value or less is considered low of that nutrient, while 15% or more is considered high. So try to choose more foods that are lower in percentage daily value and stay away or limit those items that provide more than 15% daily value of sodium. So if we look at this particular label on the screen here, we see that about 3/4 of a cup of this food product provides about 450 milligrams of sodium, which is about 20% daily value. So my question to you is this food a good option to choose on a regular basis based off of the things I mentioned? So is it more than 200 milligrams of sodium per serving? And is it more than 15% daily value? The answer is yes. So in this case, for example, let's say this is a can of soup. This food would not be a good option to choose on a regular basis just because it's a food product that's quite high in sodium. So looking at the common sources of sodium in our diet, a lot of people think that table salt is the main culprit or where most of our sodium comes from in our diet. But as you can see on the screen here, about 77% of our dietary sodium comes from processed and restaurant foods. So that's a big percentage of our dietary sodium. So as you can see, it's really those ultra processed and the fast food where we get a lot of our dietary sodium. So if you're choosing more naturally occurring foods, you're cooking more at home, you're buying more whole foods, you're naturally going to be eating a lot less sodium because you're limiting those processed foods and you're not eating out as much. So let's take a look at the sodium that's added during processing for some processed foods versus a more natural food. So starting off with plain pasta, obviously this is a processed food. It's minimally processed, but it is still processed. So pasta in its most natural form has about 5 milligrams of naturally occurring sodium. Whereas if we added some tomato sauce to that pasta, we see that it takes it from 5 milligrams of sodium all the way to 800 milligrams of sodium just by adding that tomato sauce. And then, for example, cucumbers. Obviously, cucumbers is a whole food, very, very low sodium, 2 milligrams of natural sodium in a cucumber. But then once we pickle that cucumber, we're obviously adding lots of salt. So that takes it from 2 milligrams to 385 milligrams just by pickling a cucumber. Fresh salmon, 56 milligrams of sodium. And then once we preserve that salmon, so change it to a canned salmon, still not bad in sodium, but you can see that it still adds sodium because this food product is preserved. So takes it from 56 milligrams to 272 milligrams. Cheddar cheese, for example, again, a higher sodium natural food product, so 176 milligrams per serving. But then we compare that to a processed cheese. We can see that processed cheese has a lot more sodium because it is more processed. So it takes it from 176 milligrams up to 407. And then another one, for example, just a regular drip coffee with maybe some cream and sugar, about 15 milligrams of sodium. Whereas maybe you have more of a fancy coffee, you go to Starbucks, you get a cappuccino or maybe more of a latte. You can see that just a simple drip coffee compared to a cappuccino takes it from 15 milligrams up to 250. And then something like hot chocolate has even more sodium, about 360 milligrams. So you can see how changing a food product from its most natural form into more of a processed food, so the more processing that goes on, the more sodium that's going to be added to that product. So now let's compare a fast food meal versus a home cooked meal. So for example, let's look at a fast food meal here. So we've got a fast food chicken burger with a medium fry, some ketchup, and a milkshake. So a typical fast food meal, maybe from Harvey's or, A&W, Wendy's, wherever you get a typical fast food chicken burger. So let's total up the total amount of sodium in just this one meal alone. So we've got 990 milligrams of sodium just from the chicken burger, about 540 milligrams of sodium from the French fries, 110 just from 1 tablespoon of ketchup, and then another 350 milligrams from the milkshake. So in total, we've got about 1,990 milligrams of sodium from this one fast food meal. Then let's compare that to a similar meal that's been prepared at home. So instead of a chicken burger, you make a grilled chicken breast, which is only about 64 milligrams of sodium. Instead of fries, you make a baked potato and you put a little bit of sour cream on there. So that adds another 33 and 6 milligrams of sodium. Instead of ketchup, maybe you do some fresh tomato slices, about 11 milligrams, and then some steamed broccoli and a glass of milk. So totaling all of that up, we've got about 261 milligrams of sodium. So if we compare that, you can see that the fast food meal has a lot more sodium in it, just in one meal alone. And I mentioned in previous slides that you don't want to have any more than 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day, especially on a regular basis, because that can influence your blood pressure. So if you're having a fast food meal almost every day, you're meeting your sodium intake recommendations in just one meal alone. So you can see by preparing a similar meal at home, you can reduce that amount of sodium that you're eating by a significant amount. So there are some nutrition claims that food products or food companies can disclose on some of their labels when it comes to dietary sodium. And what these claims help is they help to identify some food products or options that are lower in sodium. So looking for the word salt-free. So that essentially means that there's none or hardly any, basically less than 5 milligrams per serving. So salt-free would be a good thing to look for because that means that this product has very, very little sodium. Also the word no added salt. So this means that there was no salt added during that processing. So it contains probably very little sodium. And then some ones to choose with caution, so just be a little bit weary of, are the words low salt. So this means that there is a small amount of salt or sodium, about 150 or 140 milligrams per serving, which would be an example of like low sodium. Obviously, that is below that 200 milligrams per serving. So that would be a better option to choose, but just again, being mindful of those things. And then the word reduced sodium. So this essentially just means that there's at least 25% less of the sodium in this food product compared to the original product. So if it's a pasta sauce, maybe a soup, that would naturally have a lot more sodium in it. 25% less might not be a lot if you're comparing it to the regular amount. So again, just take a look at the back of the label and take a look at that nutrition facts table. And if, as I mentioned, if it's more than 200 milligrams per serving or over that 15% daily value, that would be a food product that you'd still want to limit. Now you might be wondering, I don't use table salt. I use pink salt instead of my regular table salt. Is that any better than just choosing regular salt? So a lot of different types of salts. So things like sea salt, pink Himalayan salt, Celtic salt, table salt, Malden sea salt, or kosher salt. If we look at the common denominator here, a salt is salt. So regardless of the type of salt that you use, it's still going to be included in your 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. So whether or not you use pink salt or table salt, it is still salt and it is still dietary sodium. So it's still going to be included in that 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day. So let's think about some reduced sodium food swaps. So thinking about snacking on more of those whole foods instead of more of those processed foods. So remembering that slide where I showed you a food in its most natural form versus when it undergoes a lot of processing. So if you're choosing more whole foods or more naturally occurring foods versus processed foods, so things like fruits and vegetables, lots of nuts and seeds, dairy products, those are going to be much less in dietary sodium versus more of a processed food. Try to flavor your foods maybe with more real ingredients, so things like garlic and onions, maybe some fresh or dried herbs, and try to choose seasonings that maybe have no salt or are very low salt because typically it's those seasonings that can add a lot of extra salt to our meals. Try to buy plain or unseasoned food whenever possible. So again, if you're buying a pre-seasoned meat, it's going to have some extra sodium in there. Whereas if you're buying an unseasoned meat, you can flavor it and you can season it on your own. So you're able to control the amount of salt that's being added. So let's talk about sugar and heart health. So a diet high in added sugar can cause chronic inflammation in the body, and that includes on the inside of the arteries. High added sugar intake is also linked with increased blood triglycerides, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and high blood pressure as well. So what's the difference between natural sugar and added sugar? And natural sugar, this is found naturally in many whole food products. So things like fruits and vegetables, dairy products, whole grains. And what's important to note about these natural sugars is yes, they provide the body with sugar or glucose, but they also provide the body with many other essential nutrients, things like fiber, protein, and many other vitamins and minerals as well. But if we compare that to added sugar, this is sugar that's been added during processing or added by you to different foods or drinks. So this includes things like sugar sweetened beverages, so pops, juices, Gatorades, lemonades, lots of baked goods, packaged foods, pre-made sauces typically have added sugar in them, and obviously lots of candies or confectioneries have added sugar in them. And if we're comparing the difference between natural sugar and added sugar, as I mentioned, those natural sugars are not a concern because they provide the body with many other nutrients that are very, very important for health. Whereas these added sugars tend to come with many other nutrients that maybe you want to limit in your diet. So that includes things like saturated fats, sodium, trans fats. So that's the difference between a natural sugar and an added sugar. So according to the daily added sugar limit or guidelines, it's recommended that for men, no more than 9 teaspoons of added sugar be consumed on a regular basis. So that also equals about 36 grams, which is also equal to about 150 calories. And then for women, It's recommended that no more than 6 teaspoons of added sugar be consumed per day, about 25 grams, which is equal to about 100 calories. So if we kind of total up the total amount of added sugar we consume right now, it's probably a lot more than that 6 to 9 teaspoons of added sugar. And that's likely because a lot of our processed foods at the grocery store have added sugar in them. So if you're choosing more of those whole foods and less of those prepackaged foods, you'll naturally be consuming a lot less added sugar. So let's look at an example. And in this case, we're looking at 1 can of Coke. So if we look at the nutrition facts label on 1 can of Coke, so per 1 can, about 355 milliliters, it's providing about 42 grams of sugar. And because this is a sugar sweetened beverage, we know that that 42 grams is coming from added sugar. So if we compare that to the daily recommendations of no more than 6 to 9 teaspoons, we can see that if we convert that 42 grams into teaspoons, we divide it by 4, and that gives us 10.5 teaspoons of added sugar in 1 can of Coke. So in one sugar sweetened beverage alone, you're already well over that recommended daily allowance of 6 to 9 teaspoons of added sugar per day. So let's look at another example. So breakfast in particular, this is an example of a typical breakfast consisting of, a bowl of cereal. This one, for example, let's say it is, Captain Crunch, Lucky Charms, something that's going to be a little bit higher in that added sugar. So that provides about 7 teaspoons of sugar just in that bowl of cereal alone. We got a glass of orange juice, which adds another 6 teaspoons of sugar. Cup of coffee, another 2, a piece of toast with peanut butter and jam, which is about 3 teaspoons of added sugar. And then maybe you're looking for another little boost of caffeine or a little bit of extra sugar. You have a can of Coke. So totaling out that typical breakfast is about 28 teaspoons of added sugar. So let's compare that to what I mentioned previously. Is it over that 6 to 9 teaspoons? Absolutely. And then we compare it to this example breakfast. So instead of having a cereal that's, full of that added sugar, low in fiber, low in lots of other nutrients, you do more of a bowl of oatmeal. So you do unsweetened oatmeal, maybe you add some fruit, maybe some nuts and seeds in there for more fiber and micronutrients. And instead, that's only going to be about 1 teaspoon of sugar. And then, of course, have your cup of coffee. You put some sweetener in there, maybe more of a, whole grain bread and a naturally occurring peanut butter and no jam on there, so no added sugar there. Instead of the glass of orange juice, you have the whole orange. Again, natural sugar, but also has fiber and lots of other micronutrients in there. And then instead of a can of Coke, you have a glass of milk. So let's compare that to previous, which was about 28 teaspoons of added sugar. And this example breakfast is only about 3 teaspoons of added sugar. So just by these simple food swaps, you can reduce that amount of added sugar that you're eating, which is going to help control your calories, lower your blood sugar, lower your blood pressure, and help to improve your overall health. So you might be wondering, what about natural sugars? So maybe you use honey or maple syrup on your oatmeal or in your coffee, and you think maybe that's a better option because it is a natural occurring sugar. But the reality is that all of those types of sugar, yes, they are natural, so they are, in their most whole form. But if we were to break them all down into its most simplest form, they still would break down into glucose. And it's glucose that influences the blood sugars and that the body uses for energy. And if we're consuming too much glucose, it gets stored as fat. So yes, you may be thinking that you're choosing the healthier option for a sugar, but it is still sugar. So at the end of the day, if you can reduce the amount of added sugar you're consuming, whether or not that is honey or maple syrup or table sugar, sugar is still sugar, and at the end of the day, less is going to be best. Now, you may be wondering, what about artificial sweeteners? There's a lot of talk online these days about whether or not artificial sweeteners are more beneficial for individuals or if you should stay away from them. So basically, what these artificial sweeteners are they are synthetic or a man-made sweetener that are generally low or even no calories. And they're essentially used for people who are looking for some fat loss or weight management, but also diabetics. So helping with blood sugar control, these artificial sweeteners essentially add no calories, but they have no sugar in them, so they're not going to be influencing that blood sugar. Also, these artificial sweeteners are about 100 times sweeter than real sugar. So typically you only need a small amount of these artificial sweeteners in order to get any sort of sweetness in a food product. As a dietitian, I do often get a lot of questions about artificial sweeteners' safety and their effectiveness when it comes to improving health. And based on the research, it does show that artificial sweeteners are generally recognized as safe for human consumption if consumed within the recommended limits. Now, high consumption of artificial sweeteners is or may cause some GI disturbance, and that's because there is a little bit of data showing that high consumption of these artificial sweeteners can influence the gut microbiome. And again, the gut microbiome is involved with digestion, it's involved with our immunity. And when those things are down because our gut microbiome is imbalanced, that can cause another plethora of issues. So, with anything, there can be too much of a good thing. So, it's important to stay within limits of these artificial sweeteners. And it's also important to note that these artificial sweeteners do not replace a balanced diet, remembering to emphasize fruits and vegetables, whole grains, lean proteins, nuts and seeds, all of those things that improve human health because they provide our body with a variety of nutrients. Whereas these artificial sweeteners aren't giving our body essentially many nutrients. So it's still something that you would want to limit in your diet. But if we're talking more about weight management, if we're talking about blood sugar, and we're talking more about cardiovascular health, these artificial sweeteners would be a good option to replace some of those added sugar-filled foods or beverages in your diet. Another thing to think about as well, kind of along this topic, is aspartame. Now, there's a lot of buzz online about whether or not aspartame is, recommended, is it safe, or whether we should be staying away from it. So, based on the data from the World Health Organization, they recognize that a safe consumption of aspartame is no more than 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day of aspartame. So, if you put that into context, one Diet Coke, for example, is about 200 milligrams of aspartame. So, for example, if we took a 70 kilogram individual, which is about 150 pounds, a little bit over that, if this individual who's 70 kilograms were to drink 14 Diet Cokes per day, that would be the maximum amount of aspartame they were be able to consume in a day. So if we take that 70 kilograms, we multiply it by that 40 milligrams per kilogram per day, that would give us 2,800 milligrams of aspartame per day, which is about 14 Diet Cokes. So that kind of puts it into context or perspective as to how many of these Diet Cokes or these zero sugar sweetened juices or pops you would actually have to consume in order to reach that upper limit or that highest limit amount of aspartame per day before causing any potential toxicity or adverse health consequences. Now let's dive into the topic about dietary fats. Now, one of the most important things that I'd like you to take away from this presentation is that not all fats are created equal. And as a dietitian, I often see a lot of new patients who come to me after they've had blood work done and maybe their cholesterol numbers are high. They say to me that they're trying to eat low fat or essentially no fat, which is not what you want to do when it comes to improving your cardiovascular health because not all fats are created equal. And in this presentation, I hope to be able to decipher the difference between dietary fats, which fats you want to have more of in your diet, and the other types of fats that you maybe want to have a little bit less of. So starting off, let's talk about saturated fats. Now, these are the types of dietary fats that you want to have in moderation or limit in your diet because they can increase the LDL cholesterol in your bloodstream. Now, saturated fats are quite high in animal fats. So typically red meat products, so beef, pork, or lamb tend to be a lot higher in saturated fats. Also, dairy products. So the higher the milk fat percentage in your dairy products, the higher that saturated fat content. Also, tropical oils, so things like coconut oil or palm oil, are quite high in saturated fats. And also ultra processed foods, so things like fast food or prepackaged foods tend to be a lot higher in those saturated fats because they are ultra processed. On the other hand, we've got unsaturated fats, which these types of fats are very beneficial or positive when it comes to dietary fats because they actually have cardiovascular protection. And that's because these unsaturated fats actually lower that LDL cholesterol and increase the good cholesterol in the bloodstream. Unsaturated fats are very high in things like plant oils, so things like olive oil, avocado oil, canola oil, lots of those oils which are very high in unsaturated fats. And also things like nuts and seeds, so almonds, pistachios, pecans, walnuts, ground flax seeds, chia seeds, pumpkin seeds. All of those are forms of unsaturated fats, which you want to have more of in your diet. Now let's go through a bit of a refresher when it comes to the types of cholesterol in the bloodstream, specifically the good and the bad cholesterol. So I mentioned the word HDL, which is the high density lipoprotein in the bloodstream, which is also known as the good cholesterol or the happy cholesterol. And if we think of it as those blue molecules, the higher percentage of HDL in the bloodstream, the cleaner those arteries are because essentially that good cholesterol acts as a broom or a cleaning tool. It helps to clean the inside of the arteries to prevent any of that plaque accumulation on the inside of the arteries. And that plaque accumulation is caused by the LDL cholesterol, so the low density lipoprotein, also known as the bad cholesterol. And if we think of it as those yellow molecules, the more yellow molecules you have in your bloodstream, the more likely you're going to have those plaque deposits on the inside of the arteries, which, as you can see, narrows the artery, limits that blood flow, and increases the risk for heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. So let's dive into the topic of saturated fat and LDL cholesterol a little bit deeper. So based on the data, high saturated fat consumption is directly linked with high LDL cholesterol and high cardiovascular disease risk. So based off the dietary guidelines, recommendations say that limiting saturated fat intake to less than 10% of your calorie intake per day is recommended. So if we dive a little bit deeper into that, that would mean about an 1800 calorie diet. 180 calories would be 10% of your daily caloric intake from saturated fat. And diving a little bit further, that would equal about 20 grams of saturated fat per day to be within that 10% caloric intake. So if we look at some common sources of saturated fat in the diet, things like red meat, so beef and pork, lamb as well, sources of saturated fat in the diet. So typically we say no more than 2 to 3 servings of red meat per week because of its high saturated fat content. Also poultry skin, so maybe you're one to do more chicken, but you like to leave the skin on. The skin is much higher in those saturated fats, so simply just peeling that off would reduce some saturated fats. Things like butter, high fat dairy products, so things that are a higher milk fat percentage, so heavy cream, high milk fat percentage yogurts, things like that would have higher content of those saturated fats. Also lard and vegetable shortening, so if you're one to do more baking, cooking with coconut oil or palm oil would add a lot of extra saturated fats in your diet. Also, beef tallow and bacon fat are also common sources of saturated fat in the diet. So, thinking about those common sources of saturated fats and whether or not you consume these things on a regular basis. If so, you likely will be over that 10% caloric intake of saturated fats, which is going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease and high LDL cholesterol. So what are some ways you can reduce your saturated fat intake in order to reduce your LDL cholesterol and improve your cardiovascular disease risk? So the first thing to do is to think about choosing leaner meat proteins. So I mentioned red meats, so things like beef, pork, and lamb tend to run much higher in saturated fats. But if you're replacing those things with things like chicken or turkey, or if you are doing red meats, trying to choose the extra lean option when it comes to beef and pork in order to remove as much of those saturated fats as possible. Try to choose more fish, so things like salmon, trout, more white fishes, so tuna, maybe haddock, pollock, all of those types of fishes. Any fish is good because fish is a lean protein, but things like salmon, trout, sardines, they also provide things called omega-3s, which are also very beneficial for heart health. So thinking about adding more fish in your diet is definitely a way to reduce saturated fat intake. Try to eat high fat meat less often. So when I say high fat meat, again, I mean those red meats. So regular ground beef, steaks, roast beef, pork chops. When we get into more of that processed meat category, we talk about things like sausages, salami, bologna, hot dogs, pepperoni, and deli meats. So you want to limit those in your diet because they tend to run much higher in those saturated fats. Try to choose plant-based proteins more often. So when I say plant-based proteins, I mean beans and legumes, so chickpeas, lentils, black beans, tofu and tempeh, which are great sources of plant-based protein, all of which are very lean sources of protein and very, very low in fat. And when it comes to dairy products, you want to choose the lower fat dairy option. So typically for milk, I say 2% milk fat or less. For yogurt, about 5% milk fat or less. And then cheese would be about 20% milk fat or less. So just thinking about your dairy products and where you can reduce that milk fat percentage to help to reduce some of those saturated fats. So let's talk about trans fats. And trans fats are a type of fat that are found in ultra processed foods. And basically what these trans fats are they undergo a hydrogenation process that essentially prolongs the shelf life and improves the taste and texture of the product. So typically it's more of those fast foods or prepackaged foods that, taste so delicious because they're very rich in those trans fats. These trans fats also increase the LDL cholesterol in the bloodstream, so the bad cholesterol, and they actually reduce the good cholesterol, which is going to increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. Trans fats are also really high in things like commercial baked goods. So donuts, cookies, muffins, things like that that you would buy from a fast food or a restaurant or a grocery store. I mentioned fast foods, pre-prepared frozen meals, so things like a frozen pizza or a frozen lasagna at the grocery store, they may have more trans fats in them because they're ultra processed. And then things like our chips, our crackers, our cookies, again, these trans fats are added to them to prolong the shelf life, but also to improve the taste and the texture of these foods. So if you're limiting those trans fats in your diet, you're limiting those ultra processed foods. That's going to help to reduce your cardiovascular disease risk, improve your good cholesterol, and lower that bad cholesterol as well. Now let's talk about the unsaturated fats. So I mentioned these are the types of fats that you want more of in your diet because they help to improve your good cholesterol. So if you're replacing your saturated fats with more of these unsaturated fats, you can lower your LDL cholesterol and lower your cardiovascular disease risk. Sources of these unsaturated fats, as I mentioned previously, are plant oils, so things like olive oil, avocado oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, flaxseed oil. All of those oils are sources of unsaturated fats that you want more of in your diet. Also, nuts and seeds of all kinds are great. Eating more olives. Olives are very rich in unsaturated fats. Also, avocados, right? Excellent sources of unsaturated fats, but also excellent sources of fiber as well. So let's get into the topic about omega-3 fatty acids. And basically what these omega-3s are they are a type of those unsaturated fats, so a very good fat in the diet. And what these omega-3s are good for is helping to lower those blood triglycerides, so a form of cholesterol in the bloodstream. And they also help to increase that good cholesterol, so the HDL. Omega-3s are also very anti-inflammatory, so they help to build the body's antioxidant defenses in the body. They support the heart and the brain and are a very, very important type of fatty acid. Some plant sources of omega-3s include things like walnuts, almonds, flax seeds, chia seeds, and avocado, while some animal sources of omega-3s include fatty fishes, so things like salmon, mackerel, trout, sardines, and even herring. Fatty fish like salmon, mackerel, sardines, and trout are very rich in omega-3 fatty acids, particularly in the form of EPA and DHA. And these forms of omega-3s help to support the heart, the brain, and particularly are helpful when it comes to reducing inflammation. Fish is also a very high quality source of protein. It's also high in vitamin D and B12 and many other essential minerals as well. Ideally, if you can include 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week, this provides a lot of these nutrients, like I mentioned, protein, lots of vitamins and minerals, but it's also giving your body that recommended amount of omega-3s to help to support your heart and your brain. Now let's take a look at a saturated fat comparison chart. So in this chart, we're going to be comparing 2 different types of fats, particularly a form of unsaturated fat to a form of saturated fat. So starting off, let's compare a tablespoon of olive oil to a tablespoon of coconut oil. So about 1 tablespoon of olive oil provides about 119 calories, 14 grams of fat, 2 of which come from saturated fat. Now comparing that to 1 tablespoon of coconut oil, it provides roughly the same amount of calories, the same amount of fat per tablespoon, but of those 14 grams of fat, 12 of those are coming from saturated fat. So comparing olive oil to coconut oil, you can see that olive oil, which is a form of unsaturated fat, has a lot less grams of saturated fat per tablespoon. Now, if we compare margarine to butter, we see that 1 tablespoon of margarine provides about 105 calories, 12 grams of fat, 1.5 of which come from saturated fat. And then comparing that to 1 tablespoon of butter, roughly the same amount of calories, 11 grams of fat, 7 of which come from saturated fats. So same thing, comparing the margarine, which is an unsaturated fat because it's made from plant oils, comparing that to butter, we see that margarine has a lot less saturated fat than butter. So now let's take a look at reading a nutrition facts table, particularly looking at things like saturated fat and trans fats. So again, remembering to always check that serving size. So for this one, for example, we're looking at a pre-made or frozen pizza. So we see that per one pizza, which is about 187 grams, we see that one serving provides 6 grams of saturated fat and 0.4 grams of trans fats. Again, if we're unsure about whether or not this is too much or too little, take a look at that percentage daily value. And we see that for saturated and trans fats, it provides 32% of your daily value. And remembering as a refresher, if it's 15% or more, that means that there's a lot of this nutrient in this food product. So for example, this pizza, 32% daily value means that there's a lot of saturated and trans fats in this product. So this would be something that you would want to limit in your diet. Now we're going to talk about dietary fiber, which is a very, very important nutrient when it comes to overall metabolic health. And what dietary fiber is it's essentially a non-digestible plant fiber that's very beneficial for things like digestion. It improves your blood sugar control because it slows down the release of glucose into the bloodstream. It helps to lower cholesterol because it gets sticky in the gut and basically sticks to some of that bad cholesterol and you're able to clear it in your stool. And it also helps with weight management because it increases satiety, it helps to keep you full for longer, which helps to reduce that extra snacking going on during the day. Ideally, men want to aim for 38 grams of fiber per day, 10 of which should come from soluble fiber. And for women, we want to aim for about 25 grams of fiber per day, again, 10 of which should come from that soluble fiber. So let's talk about the different types of dietary fiber. Now, I mentioned in the previous slide that you want to aim for about 10 grams of soluble fiber per day. And what this soluble fiber does is it helps to slow down that digestion and cause that stickiness in the gut. And that stickiness basically binds some of that LDL cholesterol, and you're able to get rid of it through your stool. So by adding more soluble fiber in, it can help to keep you full for longer, but it can also help to improve your cholesterol in your blood. Some foods that are very high in soluble fiber include things like psyllium, oatmeal or oat bran, barley, legumes, some fruits and vegetables, and flaxseed and chia seeds, all of which would contribute to that 10 grams of fiber per day. On the other hand, we've got something called insoluble fiber, which basically does the opposite of that soluble fiber. That's why it's important to make sure that you have a good balance between the two, because if you're eating too much soluble fiber and not drinking enough water and not getting enough of that insoluble fiber, it can cause a little bit of constipation because of that stickiness. It can almost turn to like cement in the gut. So that's why it's important to focus on both types of fiber to improve your digestion. Soluble fiber is really high in things like wheat bran or wheat products, lots of whole grains, and again, lots of fruits and vegetables are high in insoluble fiber as well. So let's take a look at how soluble fiber works its way through the digestive system and helps to lower the LDL cholesterol. So once you consume soluble fiber, so for example, maybe you've had oatmeal or some oat bran in the morning, basically once that soluble fiber hits the small intestine, it forms a sticky gel-like consistency in the gut. And this leads to slowed down digestion, improved blood sugar responses, longer satiety. And once it hits the small intestine, that soluble fiber gets really sticky, sticks to that LDL cholesterol, and basically removes it from the body to prevent it from being absorbed. So if you're getting that 10 grams of soluble fiber per day, that can help to lower your LDL cholesterol, but also help with weight loss, weight management, improved blood sugar response, and also supports gut health as well. So it's going to help with digestion. Now, I don't want you to go from eating essentially no fiber at all to getting all the way up to that 38 grams or 25 grams of fiber per day. One of the most important things to think about is you want to gradually increase your fiber intake over the course of a week or a couple weeks in order to prevent any digestive discomfort. So maybe right now you're only eating about maybe 10 to 15 grams of fiber total per day. I don't want you to go all the way up to 30 right away because then you might feel a little bit bloated, you might have a little bit more constipation or maybe be a little bit looser. I don't want that to happen, so it's important to gradually increase over the course of a week or so in order to build up your body's tolerance to that fiber. Another very important tip to think about is drinking lots of water. I mentioned soluble fiber gets really, really sticky, and if it gets too sticky, it can almost be like cement in the gut. And if it's cement in the gut, that means that you can feel pretty backed up and cause some constipation. So it's important to make sure that you're drinking enough water or drinking more water as you increase your fiber intake. Maybe try adding in more fruits and vegetables because fruits and vegetables have a good balance of the soluble and insoluble fiber. So starting with fruits and vegetables to increase your fiber intake could be a good place to start. Again, choose more whole grains versus those refined grains. So if you're doing a white bread right now, maybe try switching to a whole grain bread to add more fiber, whole wheat pastas versus white pastas, things like that that are going to add more fiber into your diet. Another thing I suggest to people is use fiber boosters, or I also call them nature sprinkles. So adding things like nuts and seeds to your cereal in the morning or on your yogurt. Again, these nuts and seeds are also rich in those good fats, so those unsaturated fats, but they're also rich in fiber as well. So a healthy diet is a balance between what pushes us towards good health and pulls us away from it. Those push factors include things like nutrient-rich foods like fruits and vegetables, lean proteins, whole grains, nuts and seeds, all of which are going to promote long-term health, support our energy, our immunity, and our cardiovascular health as well. Now, when it comes to the pull factors, these are things that pull us farther away from improved health. And again, this includes things like those saturated fats, So high-fat animal products, fast foods or fried foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, and ultimately those ultra-processed foods that tend to run much higher in sugar, sodium, and saturated fat. So understanding this push and pull helps us to make these intentional choices, emphasizing foods that are going to nourish us while moderating those that are going to basically push us a little bit farther away from improved health. So at the end of the day, small, consistent shifts towards those nutrient dense foods can create those long lasting improvements to overall health. Thank you for listening to part 2 of the Heart Healthy Eating Nutrition Education session.